Good morning, everyone. Welcome all of you to this ARCPA's webinar on risk assessment. A few housekeeping instructions. All of your mics are muted for the integrity of the sound, and if you have any questions, you have a button on the top called chat. You can actually type your questions and send it to us. We will integrate those questions into this webinar. And we have intentionally kept Mr. Narasimhan in the interaction in order to keep this webinar alive, more lively. This webinar has been due for a very long time, and thank you very much everyone for joining this webinar on risk assessment. I'm actually going to take this webinar in a very low level of understanding from defining what is risk thereon. Because in the recent past, we have been hearing much about this risk assessment as part of our compliance program. In the old days, we have been getting to know about risk assessment as part of a small portion of our compliance program early on. And the importance for risk assessment is growing, and the regulatory expectation to conduct this risk assessment is also phenomenon, and we are hearing this word more often. And that is because of the very importance it holds. Okay, let us see what risk really means. A risk in the Webster's dictionary is defined as risk an unknown act of something happening while carrying on an act. A risk is a negative incident which happens while you carry on an act or do a thing. So risk, in order to have a reward, you need to take a risk. Risk and reward are two positively correlating attributes. The more you risk you take, the higher the reward is. But how much risk can we take in conducting a business? A risk has to be properly managed in order to result in better intended reward. A risk managed in a proper manner has the potential for higher returns to come. A risk at the same time, unmanaged, is potentially dangerous, and the whole conduct of any transaction or any act we do can be short-lived. So in order to survive longer in a risky territory, it's very much essential for us to have efficient risk mitigation tools. And we are going to see all these in detail in the coming portion of this webinar. In this diagram, if you see, the vertical line is the value we derive out of the act, like whatever returns we get. The horizontal line is the risk taken or the efforts put in by an organization. So how much risk can we take? Because the vertical line shows how much return we get as value. The horizontal line shows the risk, the amount of risk we take. So what everyone will be intending to have is, by spending lower efforts or taking lesser risk, derive higher value. So in this, the territory we don't want to be is the lesser risk and lesser return we don't want to, because there is a potential. So when we grow our effort to an optimum level where the dotted lines are, and if the returns are very high, we will be happy. So the territory which is written as yes in the diagram is the most intended, or people would like to stay there longer and more in that territory. Therefore, the intention of any enterprises, or the most desired outcome, could be by taking lower risk to get the higher returns. I'm going to take you to my 12th standard marketing classroom where I have studied this. The word risk usually belongs to marketing or commerce subject. And nowadays, this word is more attached to legal studies, but traditionally, in an academic manner, the word risk had been attached to the subject of commerce and marketing. This is a diagram which shows that any good or supply commences from the producer and ends up in the hands of consumer. Excuse me for going this low, because the understanding of this particular topic to the maximum efficiency is required, because I am seeing that more and more people don't either want to understand this subject of risk assessment, or they want to understand it in the way they already understand it. Okay, I'm taking this to a very low platform for everyone to understand and draw a correlation between this example and what we are doing in our subject of anti-money laundering compliance. A product or a service is destinated, it has to go from a producer to a consumer. And there are a lot of hurdles in between the producer and the consumer because of many factors. The main being the distance. The producer may be in Australia and the end consumer may be in Bangladesh. This is an example. Now, the Australian producer has produced meat and he wants to export it to Bangladesh. Firstly, the hurdle is that it is two different territories and there is a clear distance between the producer and the end consumer. Okay. Now the producer has identified Bangladesh as a destination of the end user. It's a target for export. Now the problem is the consumer doesn't know that Australia produces, or a producer in Australia is producing meat. So there is an information shortage. So in the next slide, we have a campaign in the modern day, we have a very efficient way of getting this to the consumer. That is the marketing campaigns, the electronic, the social medium. This gets the information that the producer is producing meat in Australia and he is intending to export it to Bangladesh. The next hurdle is the distance and maybe the nature of the product being exported to Bangladesh, because meat is a perishable good and it needs cold storage, and cold storage built transport. So that's another hurdle. And then even if it is exported to Bangladesh, we need appropriate storages. And I have touched these three major hurdles, and I'm leaving the rest because we can't be spending so much time on this example. So the producer produces an item and he makes information spread across the consumer base, and then he makes arrangements to transport, store, and sell these products in the destination country. Now, the producer and his manager will sit down and make a list of what can go wrong in the campaign, why we can and we cannot use social media as a campaign information domain, and what can go wrong in the transportation, what are all the procedures, what is the packing methodologies, what can go wrong in all these things, and then what can go wrong in the storage, the local laws governing this particular product sales in Bangladesh. There may be halal certificates required. There may be quality assurance required. There may be a fire in the transport. There may be a fire in the warehouse. There may be a negative campaign in the media, the social medium in which we are promoting this information. All these need to be studied earlier and need to be honestly listed by the producer. I hope everyone understands this example, because in the process of getting the meat produced in Australia to a country of destination involves a lot of mediums, because they are not easy to get from point A to point B. 3, then all these items, activities, the devices we use, the factors we use can run over risk. If we don't foresee the risk, we can never be able to mitigate them. I mean, that is exactly what we do in what we do as remittance providers in Australia. So we create a company, and we are also governed by, most of our service providers are governed by the Corporations Act, and the regulator who governs Corporations Act is ASIC, Australian Securities and Investment Commission. I'm only touching base with those main legislative frameworks which governs our industry. There are many other common law platforms on which these businesses are built on. When we say compliance, we always look at Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorism Act only. Now the framework, because the expectations have grown up, need to be broadened, because these are all those legislations, A plus B plus C plus D. It is not a particular legislation we need to comply with. Yes, Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorism Financing Act is the main driver here, but there are many other legislations we have to comply while conducting um, a remittance provider or currency exchange business here. So the second main being the Competition and Consumer Protection Act 2010, and which is actually built over the Trade Practices Act 1988. ACCC is the regulator who governs and administers this law. And there are this is one main which many people neglect to really look into. The Australian Privacy Commission and the Office of the Australian Information Commission. These are, because we are operating in a very much electronic and digital manner nowadays. Not anyone I have seen is operating with pen and paper only. So we store information, we pass on information electronically. So this is one main act we need to really take on board and comply with. Fair Work Australia, in the conduct of employing and taking people on board for employment, we need to comply with. And finally, our own Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorism Financing Act 2006. So these are all the main acts we need to comply and take these provisions on board. Now, I'm taking you to a funnel approach. And this goes for all the legislation we have seen earlier in the slide just we have seen. So in bringing all these legislations, there are international efforts we need to comply with. If we take our Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorism Act 2006, the precedence is coming from FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. So obviously, AML-CTF Act 2006 covers the jurisdiction of Australia. But if you are providing service across one or more jurisdictions, it is a good idea for you to go one step above and learn the provisions and the recommendations, the 40+ recommendations afforded by FATF, on which all these regional and countrywide anti-money laundering or Prevention of Money Laundering Act and Counter-Terrorism Act, AML-CTF or AML-CFT, whatsoever. The name changes according to the jurisdictions, but we need to comply with our own national, and if we are operating across jurisdictions, it is also mandatory for you to look into the international perspective of the same act on which we are working and founded on. So the international efforts come first, and then the countrywide legislations, in which case AML-CTF Act, Commonwealth AML-CTF Act 2006. And this is a piece of legislation which is passed in the parliament and comes to force on a particular date. And the guidelines are those interpretations given by the regulator or the supervising body. In our case, it is ASTRAC. Rules are those interpretations, or sometimes if we take our own AML-CTF Act, that act gives the CEO of ASTRAC a lot of power to produce their own rules. As an FIU and supervisor, ASTRAC takes that legislative power and produces interpretative and guideline rules. So these all together brings the broader governing framework under which we have to work. But why I have drawn this on a funnel shape? Because they are broader. They cover the insurance industry, the deposit taking, banking industry, the superannuation industry, anything and everything which comes under the financial framework, services framework. So anything and everything, because even though we are still expecting our trench too, there are many service providers who are not covered, but we hope that they will be covered one day. But those banking, superannuation, insurance, financial services providers, gambling industry, and all our own remittance providing industry, all these are different industries which are governed by this broader framework. So in the yellow territory, the compliance manager or the chief risk officer sits there. He analyzes all those broader frameworks and brings those essential part of the legislation and the rules and regulations to our own enterprise. Okay, it is a 1,000-page legislation, maybe 2,000-page guidelines, and another 500-page rules. Do we really have to worry about all those? Not necessarily. Maybe some chapters are affecting our particular enterprise. Some rules don't affect us because we don't touch that product or service. Some doesn't affect us because the way we do is not the way which is spoken about. Let me give you a very good example of what we don't need to worry about is the provision of digital currency. We don't do. So there is a new portion of legislation and the interpretative rules which touches base with the Bitcoin and digital currencies which are new to the industry. We are not covered by that. So we don't need to register for it, and we don't need to be governed by those. So we only take those part of the legislation, guidelines, and rules which affects our own enterprises and the products and services we do and the people we provide this service to and the territory in which we are functioning. And that is the job of the risk and compliance department in any enterprise. But when we come to smaller companies, we may have one person who is a director, who is also a compliance manager, and he is the service provider too. So he may or get someone externally to help him. But remember, you are the only person who can do this in full. Any external person can assist you in understanding it, but it can never be a solution which is bought over from anyone. You can get experts to help you do that job of bringing the essential portion which affects our enterprise from the whole lot of information available out on the space and in the legislative framework. So when we take those information which are necessarily affecting us, that is, and provide a portion in our compliance program which enumerates what is affecting our industry, our enterprises, our products and services, and people we provide this service to, and that is called Part A of our compliance program. This is essentially what a correlation between what we do in our enterprise and what is the legislative guidelines and rules available in relation to that service provision. And we come now to our own, the subject of the day called risk assessment. And before I move on to explain that, because that red area is what we are going to talk about in detail now. But before that, let me also finish the full framework by explaining, after we do what we are going to talk about, which is called risk identification, assessment, and building the risk framework, we need to find out in our part B how these risks are mitigated during the conduct of our business. That's part B, which is a document which clearly states our practical and policy framework of what exactly we do in order to take the legal framework and identify how risky it presents to our business, and then what are we really doing to reduce or completely eradicate the risk from happening in ours. And finally, we need to make sure this is fitting at any point of time, ongoing, because the whole risk identification can change by any event out in the space, out internationally, nationally, and within our own framework. For example, change in some staff within our organization can also change the risk profile of any particular portion of our compliance program. Therefore, it is very important for us to keep the risk under control, identified, assessed, and mitigated at any point of time during the conduct of our business. See, being muted doesn't mean that you cannot ask any questions. Please either raise your hands. There is a button for in the icon of hand, or write your doubt in the shape of chat as a message, and I will definitely take this on board at any point of time, because it is very important that we build the clear understanding as we progress. So what will happen if we don't really comply, if we don't really care about? I always wanted to say this because many organizations where I had been to assist or speak to or conduct external review, people usually think, and that is why I'm personalizing this webinar to our own industry and our own people, not to put down anyone by any reputation. Please understand, there is no way where we can think that I don't present any risk, or my environment of operation is not risky. And I have heard this from people on a daily basis, that I am the best provider, I have the best compliance framework. You know, do you think a bank which is out in Australia, who coped multi-100 million penalty, they haven't done anything on the compliance? They did so much, they spent so many millions, but yet risk presents. There are areas where we have missed something, and that is potentially huge. Some people, when we build also systems, I have heard this in the last week conference, someone told me a big bank in New Zealand had wrongly linked 2 database fields, and that had been going on for 9 years, and they didn't know. So these are all small things. We think we are very clever, we are very efficient, and we are doing everything right, and I don't have any problem. That should not be our attitude towards risk, because risk is something which is similar to our own fire alarm systems. We keep fire alarms in our houses for a very good purpose, and this is legislatively mandated to keep and maintain a fire alarm in our house. Sometimes when it goes, if it is too much alarming, we remove the battery and throw it away. What good an alarm is kept there in order to protect us from a possible fire while we sleep, or in a time where we are highly vulnerable. But removing a battery and saying, oh, this is sounding too much, I just removed it or I just disabled it, is not going to give us the intended safeguard by installing that framework, that particular device at home. So there is a risk of fire, and this can happen anytime we don't expect to happen. And if we keep our systems, the protective systems, disabled or lowered, thinking that it will never happen, usually risks do happen at the time that we don't expect them to happen. So what if we don't comply and just don't care about our compliance program or compliance procedures? We may lose our reputation, we may get financial penalties, and we may be thrown out of our industry, so we lose our opportunity, prosecution, and imprisonment. And I just want to caution all of our members by saying that in the past quarter, ASTRAC has expressed it in many forums we have attended, that they are taking this guiding or providing the information campaign in anyway, but that doesn't mean that they are going to keep watching the breaches. They have already commenced prosecuting and penalizing wrongdoers. There is no more excuses. That time, because from 2006, now it is our 13th year of introduction of AML-CTF framework, and we are still learning thanks to all our campaigns and all maybe what we have provided from ARCPA, ASTRAC, every conferences we have attended. But it is really very unfortunate that it took 13 years, or even it's going to take 15 years to still learn and get what we need to know about in this framework. So let us come to this. Let us come to this serious job of how a risk assessment happens. We need to understand this, that a risk assessment is the foundation of the building of a compliance framework, AML-CTF compliance framework. Without a honest risk identification and assessment, whatever document we call as compliance program should not be an effective document in practice. That's why this importance of compliance risk assessment is growing day by day. So let me present my perspective of how an effective risk assessment and risk identification can be done. Now, if you go to FATF recommendation, there is a word very often used in that document is called predicate offense. A predicate offense is an offense which leads to money laundering. So it's a serious offense. When we say money laundering, there is a clear, sometimes there is a clear misunderstanding of what a money laundering is. A money laundering, is it something which we do through hawala? Is it something we do through hundi? Not necessarily. Money laundering is only a process which succeeds an offense. There must have been an offense happened, after which that proceeds of the crime, the financial outcome of that offense is legitimized through money laundering. So, see, laundry should always proceed making a cloth dirty, isn't it? If you don't have a dirt, you cannot wash it. So there must have been an offense happened already. So an offender, as soon as it happens, they get a reward for doing that offense. And that reward need to be consumed by them in a comfortable manner. So what they do, they first do an offense, and then they try to get the reward for that offense, and try to make sure that no one knows about it, that it has come out of an offense. So it's a matter of concealing the illegitimacy of these financial proceeds. So let us go through each of those predicate offenses, because we have passed half of this session, and these are the very important area. And I have intentionally provided a very low level of presentation earlier, just to bring this understanding to everyone in the manner I have intended to bring it to. So the predicate offenses are those, I will just read them and you will understand what they are as I read them. Participation in an organized criminal group or racketeering, terrorism, including terrorist financing, trafficking in human being and migrant smuggling, sexual exploitation, including sexual exploitation of children. This one line, I want to emphasize, this is growing, and there is a very big organization being penalized now or under investigation for this offense. Illicit trafficking in narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances, illicit arms and trafficking, illicit trafficking in stolen and other goods, corruption and bribery, fraud. It's a very broad item, because many organizations in the modern compliance framework, they have an anti-fraud policy, procedure, and mitigation process. This is a completely different segment for many organizations in the forefront of the financial services provision. Counterfeiting currency, counterfeiting and piracy of products, environmental crimes, murder, grievous bodily injury, kidnapping, illegal restraint and hostage taking, robbery or theft, smuggling, extortion, forgery, piracy, insider trading, and market manipulation. For those who don't know what is insider trading, is that any share of an enterprise which is traded in public, the office bearers or the board of directors or any senior manager who had been involved in the decision making process of that enterprises may possess additional information which is relating to tomorrow's share value. For example, if we are going to announce this decision tomorrow or today evening, therefore the share value may go up or down. Therefore, I will pass this information to one of my relative or associate and try to get profit out of it. And that is called insider trading. And in many occasions, it's a very hard offense to prove, but once it is proved, it is a very bad effect which brings out. So insider trading and market manipulation, tax evasion is added in the last 5 years' time, also an offense now. So this is a list, and I want you to multiply this by the next few columns, which I'm showing in the next column. So each of these offenses need to be analyzed by taking one of our product. Take the product and analyze whether this product presents any opportunity for all these predicate offense to happen through provision of that product or service. And take the jurisdiction in which you are operating and analyze all these items. So what I am suggesting here is take this list of predicate offense, multiply by each time by the product, service, jurisdiction, customers. The customers also can present you with different types of customers, different types of employees. Employees, if you take, there are people who are directly involved in AML CTF regulatory framework. There are people who are on the forefront of the service provision. There are people who are stakeholders who need to understand the business promotion people, business development people. So if you, I'm just shrinking it, but you can keep multiplying by each item in the yellow portion by this, by the green portion. And then the light blue, general perception. Fiduciary perception is that if you are a board of director and you are not directly involved in the day-to-day affairs of AML CTF compliance, you need to understand where is your fiduciary liability standing, because you may be liable for things which you have failed to do. So you need to look into all these in your perception. So I am a director and I have subscribed my name whether I like it or not. But at the end of the day, I'm responsible for the well-being and the conduct of the organization throughout the provision of this service and products and services in the jurisdiction and to the customers intended. So how an employee looks into these risks. So if you take the first green column, multiply with how many of these? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 20 into 8, you have 160 factors to consider. And then 160 multiplied by 8. And whatever number comes. So that many dimensions to the risks of these components in the yellow multiplied by the number of risks that can happen in the manners this is the minimum you should do in order to identify the risk. And then the perception. Sorry. And the time, past, present, and future. The same thing, how it fared in the past, how is it going now, and how it may change in future. So if we take a simple organization and if we need to do a list of risk what can go wrong, minimum we should have the 20 multiplied by 8 multiplied by 8 multiplied by the perceptions multiplied by 3 tenses, past, present, and future. So that many risks we can list by, this is for identification of risks. This is a template of how a risk assessment or risk identification list can be. This can be, so you can code them according to the perception, you can code them according to who the party who will be affected by regulatory risk. You can take it as fiduciary risk, you can take it as employee risk, you can take it as customer risk, as many risks as you know. You can even copy from other people, but always make sure there may be other areas which you have left to be identified. This is in order not to miss, but that doesn't mean all of them are fit. But it is good to know other people's risk also, so that we can identify whether it is really relevant to our framework. You can copy from others the list of risks, but make sure you also go do further analysis of how much risk we are missing, which is suitable for us in different perspectives and tenses and all those lists. Because there may be risk we know which can happen, but may not be as relevant to our environment. But it is good to have them listed, because it is always good to have more on our risk list to see them, revisit them, and see whether they are affecting our framework. So if you see in this, we have the name of the firm, completed by, and this is for the period. It is valid from this date to that date, and then the senior management's approval. And the first column is the risk identification, the code of the risk, and then this is the perspective of the risk and the detail of the risk. And the likelihood score, that's why I said you can copy from other people. Only this risk list you can copy from others, but it should not be your conclusive summary or the list of risk, because yours may be more additional. So the likelihood is how relevant to your organization, how much, like between 1 to 10, how likely it is about to happen in our environment in the conduct and the period of provision of service and product. And the impact score is some risk. If they do happen, the damage may be less. For some risk, if they happen, the damage may be very high. For example, if a report, a TTR report being missed to be reported to ASTRAC is a very serious thing nowadays. And the impact of this could potentially be a high amount of penalty. Okay, now let's see. Now there is a false positive optimization in that if you fail to include one component of the risk scoring and you want to go back and adjust it, that may be less impacting. And maybe I'm presenting a wrong example, but there may be other risks which are less grievous to less damaging to our framework. So based on those, you assign a 1 to 10 number to the likelihood, and 1 to 10 number in the impact. For example, in the next slide, we are going to see a graph of how that presents in a representative. If a risk is high likelihood and high damage impact, will be highly risky. Either you need to measure whether you want to continue doing that or doing that service, or if you want to be in that territory, or you need to spend, if your rewards are greater, you need to spend greater efforts and maybe spend more, allocate more resources to the mitigation process. And the fifth column is the cross-reference in your part B, how you have really worked out your mitigation process against each risk identified. And then the last two columns are very, very important to assign someone who is responsible for the ongoing control of that risk, and based on the importance of the risk, you can revisit by a particular date or time, in 3 months time, in 6 months time, or 12 months time. You can revisit that risk. And not just that, it's a very important matter for us to maintain a risk diary in our organization, because day in, day out, we come across new examples from the conversations we have on the execution of compliance. For example, today there is a customer presented what we can do in that particular circumstances. We have spoken about it, we have dealt with that situation, and then we don't leave it. We take a note of it, and if there is any lesson to be learned, and if we have to revisit the compliance program or the risk list, we have to do that as soon as practicable. We don't need to go back and revisit our risk book or risk compliance program on a daily basis. But if we have substantial diary notes to go back and do a revision, let us do that. We don't need to really wait for 3 months to, but it is like the car vehicle maintenance, either this many kilometer or that date, whichever is earlier. So if the diary is full of lessons to be learned, it's quicker for us to go and fix the risk book and the compliance program, not to wait for the 3 month schedule. So if we don't have any diary note of the incidences, then it's a good idea for us to stick to the scheduled date of revisiting the risk book. So this is the risk heat map. So this is the probability of the risk happening in our organization and the severity of the impact. So if you take the green area, these are the blocks where the likelihood is also lower and the impact is also lower. And the yellow area are those which are may happen, but the impact are moderate. And the pink ones are those the impact is major and they may sometimes happen. And the catastrophic area is something which is very, very red, and the following applies to that block. One, it should be either avoided or we need to employ a lot of resources from our compliance department towards those risk items. Or they can seriously affect our, the so-called, they can bring those effects of non-compliance to our organization. So this is another way of representing the same thing. This is called the heat map. So the heat increases. When you mix the green and red, it presents yellow because they are moderate. So the green area is very safe, and in the yellow area, you play very carefully, and in the red area, you need to be extremely careful, or if the reward is less, you better avoid that. If the reward is high, you need to spend a lot of efforts and resources in keeping those risk items intact and under control. And this is one area which is part of the next portion of our compliance webinar, but I still want to present it to you because a lot of efforts need to go in keeping the compliance program is not something we buy from outside and keep for the next 3 years to come, because they are dynamic document of our compliance framework. They can be changed as frequent as 1 week, because if we have enough items or the lessons learned from your day-to-day practices, or if any changes which are presenting those necessity to go there. So risk assessment is a very important area, or I consider, or the piling of the high-rise building we are about to build. And I'm now open to any questions. We have 5 minutes. 5 minutes is too less for question and answers. I will open all the mics now in absence of our chat questions. Anyone can ask questions now. And once someone is speaking, please keep quiet and wait for your opportunity to ask that question. Yes, I have unmuted all. Any questions? Sir, do you have any question? Someone is speaking, but please raise your voice and ask that question.
Bank statement payment.
I don't think there is any questions now.
No.
Going to
Ram, can I interrupt? In fact, good afternoon, Narasimhan here. Thanks for participating in this program conducted by Ram, who has exactly outlined the risk factors pretty much well. Probably if you don't have any questions immediately, you might come across something at a later stage, or rather you might think about it and want to have some clarification about it. So which Ram will be open to receive emails also. And you can all share your thoughts to Ram. Probably you have Ram's email ID, I believe. You can send your emails to them and he will certainly respond to that.
Certainly, we have opened a lot of channels now for everyone to ask questions and clarify their doubts. They can email me, they can post questions in our WhatsApp group or anywhere. I'm only glad to attend to those questions. I thank everyone for attending this very important webinar. And we will be doing another webinar next month around the date mid of November. The date will be announced very soon, and that will be around dynamic building a dynamic compliance program. Okay, so that will be the topic, and I encourage everyone to attend, and I thank all the participants in this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ram. Thanks.
Thank you.